Welcome, thinkers, to Season 3, Episode 14 of Thinking Critically. Today's episode is Relationships. And today I'm joined by Hunter Royall. Thank you ever so much for joining us today, Hunter. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I have been playing D&D since the latter years of 2nd edition. I cut my teeth, been more or less a forever DM since 3rd edition, 3.5. Been through all the edition wars since. While I do have a favorite that isn't, my favorite is not 5th edition. I love what 5th edition has done. I could talk for hours on what I've learned about D&D. I am the DM of a podcast, live play in 5th edition. It's called A Sundered World. It is set in my homebrew world of Buith. It is the setting of the novel that I've published that I'm still in the process of trying to write the sequel for. It's a setting that I have been trying to develop and get published for 5th edition, Pathfinder 1st and 2nd edition, a couple other different mechanic systems for a little while. And the podcast kind of goes over more of the past and the history of it. We've got some Patreon stuff that covers more of the present and adventures and how things turn out from there. I am a bit of a... I always feel awkward saying this, but I am a bit of a Renaissance man, and that because saying that just feels like I'm bragging.
If you do say so yourself, yeah, all right.
But yeah, I'm a published author. I do have some artistic talent. I'm actually doing some of the initial, at least until I have I'm doing the basic artwork for the setting book, and hopefully I'll get someone more professional when I can get the money. But I currently work in healthcare as a nurse. I worked on automobiles before that, so like my skills range all over the place. So and I draw from all of that, not only in my storytelling but in how I present my world and how I explain things. And that's one of the reasons I chose our topic today to talk to you about.
Thank you for that perfect segue. I love it. I love it when the guests do that. Talking of today's topic, it is relationships. So what does that mean to you in the D&D and wider TTRPG framework?
It's multi-tiered. Primarily what it means is the relationship between the DM side or storyteller or GM or whatever you call it based on whatever game you're playing, and the players. Because you have to have a good, clear mesh between those two settings in order for everybody to have fun. But it's more than that. It's how do your player characters relate? What are their relationships with the world itself that you're telling? I mean, like, are they truly the main characters of the story? Are they just people that are interacting with a world? It's, if you're playing a fantasy game, is it how does what's the relationship of magic to the popular opinion? What's the relationship of the gods of your world, or not just the relationships with themselves but with the people that worship them? It's what are the relationships of the races within said world? For some of the darker the darker, more modern settings, like especially like in the White Wolf World of Darkness, it's how do you play on the relationships between the vampires in your city under the Masquerade? How do you work with the relationships between the different werewolves in your pack, et cetera, et cetera? And it's not just that, but it's also relationships between the players and their own characters, because of they're going to be drawing on from their own experiences, their own knowledge, and putting that into their character, and are they meshing with their character? Do they have a good idea of what their character would do? Are they, how well are they able to separate themselves and their knowledge from the character itself and what their character would do?
Hmm. Let's begin with that out of game. Well, I say out of game, it's all kind of related to the game, but you know what I mean. Um, out of universe relationships, then I think that one you just mentioned there between the player and the character is a really, 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 really good one, and can sometimes I feel like be overlooked. Maybe that's not the right term, but there's always in terms of like DM's guides and players guides, there's always a lot of focus on other bits like making sure your turn is ready in combat and understand what your character abilities are, and for the DM, like don't railroad and so on and so on and all that kind of stuff. But I think there's a lot to be said there for that more the softer side of a player's relationship with their character, like how they feel towards that character. Because certainly know I mean, there's players in my game that can sometimes towards like almost animosity or resentment towards their own characters in a certain way in certain times, either because they're not happy with how they're playing or how that character build is performing. So I think there's a lot there that's kind of hidden away in the periphery, in the details, that often doesn't get a spotlight shown in it. So have you got any experience there in those kind of subtle details, or any kind of interesting anecdotes where that has come to light or been an issue?
I don't have any anecdotes that readily come to mind, but that is something that I take an active role in trying to to avoid, especially with figuring out, especially with new characters, what's the best way for them to get into the game, learn things without feeling like they made bad choices and feeling like they're stuck. Because one, I generally, in my casual games, if somebody's having problems with a character, under most circumstances, I am perfectly fine with them saying, "Hey, I'm just not having fun with this character.
Hmm.
Can I retire them and move them out?" And like, as long as we haven't like cut off from the last session, like right before a boss fight, or we're
Yes.
something like that, I'm like, okay, yeah, let's go and work something out. And what I try to do is, especially if I notice one with somebody first creating a character, and then if I notice them not having fun with the character, I try to talk to them about it. I try to figure out, what are their goals for their character idea.
Mm.
And especially with some of these characters, there are a lot of concepts that uh, well, let me back up a little bit. It's that D&D is a game with rules. And, yes, as the DM, we have final arbitration over that. We can, throw rules out or change them as we will. But the rules provide a kind of a structure.
Hmm.
So and the rules only have a limited framework for things within the rules and how you can build a character. Now, that obviously doesn't make it only makes it theoretically open to every concept that you could have. So I have to talk with the players and, like, okay, I want to make a rogue, but instead of like I want to have like this particular background or something that's not really covered by
Hmm.
anything, and I kind of wanted him to be, like this. Maybe they'll pick a character from popular culture that they
Yeah.
want to kind of emulate that doesn't really fit the rogue class, but it's the only
Yes.
one that kind of, but it doesn't, but it fits all the others even less. So sometimes it's as easy as, oh, okay, yeah, that character is primarily rogue, but with fighter levels. So why don't you
Yeah.
go and, okay, we're starting at level 5 anyway, so make yourself a level 3 rogue with this particular specialization, and then throw in a couple levels of fighter to kind of add everything to it. Or it's like, oh, you want to play like a character wants to play kind of a Sun Soul monk, but they want to have more of a Dragon Ball Z style
Hmm.
to it. Okay, well, we can change, instead of radiant damage, we can just change your little key blast to force, and then maybe we can at later on we'll go and trade out this class ability for the ability for you to like spend a key point, and then you get like 10 minutes of flight or
Hmm.
whatever, you
Yeah.
know. So that, and that way that gives them, that helps get your characters more involved. One, if they feel like they have more control over customizing the character and, making that character theirs,
Yeah.
then they have a stronger relationship with the character.
Mm.
It also means that they feel it empowers them. It makes them feel more in control, and that way it also makes it a better relationship with you as the DM. So that way, when you do have to make the hard decisions, and like you can't really do that with this skill, or you can do that, but it's going to be
Yeah.
really difficult. You know, that way they're less likely to cause arguments. They're more likely to roll with it and try and find more creative ways. That also gives you a better way to understand their character and help them find, like, even suggest creative ways of dealing with a situation that their characters may have had something come to mind, but they as a player might not, because that's,
Mm.
they're different people.
Hmm. Yeah, that last thing there you mentioned is incredibly difficult to to manage, both from a player and a DM's perspective. But that kind of not hand holding, but mentoring or guiding, I suppose, from the DM's point of view, is like super important. And it's a failing that I've had in the past. I've mentioned it before on the show about a couple of my newer players building characters. I offered my services, but then they pretty much built them in isolation to a certain extent. And so I've got a druid player who had a very strong vision first time into D&D, very strong vision like you were describing. I kind of want to this is the vision and theme I want for my character. I guess a druid best fits that. It was that way round, which from my personal point of view, when I'm building characters, a little bit cart before horse. So that combined with learning the rules, learning the framework, learning the scope, what is and isn't practical, has led to a number of instances when he's quite clearly forlorn, for lack of a better term, in terms of like I've had to be like that thing doesn't really work that way for reasons that will take too long in the middle of the game to explain. But needless to say, you can't just do that, or you can't just do this, or that doesn't really work that way, but you can do it this way instead. And those instances have caused never any friction, and the guy, we get along super well and stuff, but there has been instances, and that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier on, where he's, maybe I'm reading a bit too much between the lines, but it did feel like in a certain cases he was getting a bit frustrated with this character that he's built that isn't quite like living up to the expectation he had in his head, which is difficult. And in a way, now that player character has died, is kind of good that he has an opportunity now to build something from scratch again with all that 3 years worth of gaming knowledge behind him, to build something that's a V 2.0, and should hopefully he should have I mean, it was already a good relationship, so I don't want to say a better relationship, but a more effective relationship, shall we say?
Yeah, efficiency is I guess is a better. I mean, it's not really a bad thing to say the relationship is better, because that just means that, okay, you've recognized where the flaws were and you've worked to overcome those difficulties, and that's always a better thing. My background is, I forgot to mention, my background, particularly in nursing, is mental health, so this is kind of a yeah. So there's going to be a lot of anybody who's been to therapy is going to occasionally recognize, like, you're saying things in a certain way, but I mean, there's the problem with like being a good DM is that most of it has to be self-taught, because
Hmm.
you can watch every YouTube how-to guide on how to be a good DM, or like these are all the signs of a bad DM, and like learn everything you can. You can ask other DMs for advice all the time. But the thing is, each game is its own separate thing, and each batch of players are their own individual people, and they don't always like even from game to game, like even if you have like the same group and you finish one campaign, you start another, like they're not necessarily going to be the exact same in that second campaign that they are in the first one. So there's only so much you can learn. Most of it has to come from, you actually experiencing being in the DM's chair and understanding, learning to pick up the cues and figure out, okay, where do we go from here? Or, a lot of times it's not just asking the question of, hey, is everybody having fun, but knowing
Yeah.
how to ask that question, because,
Indeed. Yeah.
because sometimes like people will go and they'll go and you ask them and they're like, well, yeah, overall I had fun. But, if sometimes like you can miss cues, and
Yeah.
and there are times when you think a relationship is good and it's not, and it's not until it blows up in your face that suddenly you realize, oh crap, this is where I should have, this is where I misstepped, this is where I should have changed things, this is where I should have asked, more in-depth questions, or
I think well, you put it really well, that knowing how to ask that question is incredibly difficult but incredibly useful. And maybe this is more, maybe this is a cultural thing with us British being very polite, but that happens a lot. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. When inside, that person is not fine. And that isn't a D&D thing. That's just a life thing. Certainly over here. So it's very easy to be, is everyone having fun? Yeah, man, that's fun. I had fun. They're thinking, this guy spent a lot of time on it, so let me, just tell them it was fine, even though maybe he wasn't having a lot of fun. So just saying, are you having fun, can not be very effective in that. Well, you're leading the witness a little bit, because you're saying, you're not, it's a loaded question, right?
yeah.
Are you having fun? Well, yeah, because that's way easier than any other answer. Whereas at least the step in the right direction is, how are you enjoying it? I guess off the top of my head is maybe ever so slightly better, but still has the same problems. But yeah, no, I'm not about to solve that off the top of my head now. But no, that is something that I've struggled with. And even if all the answers are genuinely yes, that self-doubt, that imposter syndrome is screaming at you, they're lying.
Yeah.
Then they're not having fun, because he sneezed once when we were playing, and only unhappy people would sneeze. So
Oh my
you're terrible.
Yeah, that's one thing that I have been super critical on myself with the podcast, because with a casual game, there's you can reach a point where like everybody's like, yeah, we're having fun, but this just kind of isn't our thing, and you can just toss the whole thing out and say like, okay, well, this is a fun idea, but I guess it just doesn't work with this group, or I'll have to table it for later. Maybe I've got to like, we'll go and shelve it for now and see if I can like rework it to be better for this group or whatever. With the podcast, I can't do that. So the majority of my conversations with my players have been trying to figure out where they want to go with their characters, being heavily involved in trying to write plot lines tailored to them, that really give them time to role play, to explore what they're doing, figure out more about their characters and their connection to the world. I want to go and I try to keep them involved. I give them input. Currently, we just finished up season 2 recording, and like I want to, the next season, of course, I want to focus more on a couple of characters, because there were 2 characters that got a lot of screen time in this past season, just because of how I built the plot lines to kind of like bring them, bring the party into this adventure. And the one before, I kind of gave a lot of screen time to a couple of other 2 because of how how they interacted with the world. And I want to build the next plot line, kind of like there were the final 2 characters haven't really gotten to have but so much interaction with the world, haven't really, other than what they've, what I've tried to throw their way throughout everything else. they haven't really gotten much to really display like where their characters are, what who their characters are. So I've been talking with them and trying to figure out, okay, where do you want to go with this? What do you want to explore with your character? Is there anything in particular about the world you want to know about? You want to do with your character? Is there anything like? Is there any kind of lore you want to explore? Or do you want to do geography? This, that, and the other. Just trying to make sure that they're not feeling left out, that they are getting the same amount of interaction with the world that everybody else is, that they're not having to make it up themselves, that I'm giving them as many prompts as everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And that has really been, I feel, has been a bigger test of my skills as a DM than anything else, because one, it gives me a lot of perspective behind the scenes, because before I decided to do this, I had been listening to a couple of different live play podcasts
Mm-hmm.
for decent amount of chunk of time, and I'm sitting there and I'm listening to how everything flows together and how like all the characters work together and how everybody kind of sounds like they're getting along, and then when I start doing it myself, suddenly realize, oh, that's just the tip of that iceberg. There is so much underneath that, I just never even, I had an idea of what editing all the audio was going to be like. I didn't know what it was going to be like until I actually started.
Mm-hmm. That is a pain, I know. And very recent, because we've just had the episode on editing, funnily enough, on the show, which talks all about the joys of that particular issue there, starting from scratch as well.
I've been debating about listening to that one, because I was like, is this going to is this going to cause some PTSD for me, or is this,
So it's a funny anecdote. We're digressing for a second, but so obviously I produce and edit this, and it's not too bad now. It's 2 clean tracks from my solo audio, the guest solo audio, in isolation, typically in a pretty decent space, not like in an aircraft hangar or whatever. And I've learned a lot, and do my effects and improvements and post-production and so on and so on. And then I also play in a podcast actual play, but I very much do as little as possible in that, because I'm like, I just want to enjoy the fact that we're playing, and you guys can worry about the podcast side of things, because I have to worry about that enough as it is. But then I thought, hey, like, I've got my FX chains set up, I've got my my DAW set up and whatnot. So the last episode I said, hey, before you go and cut out all the garbage bits that we don't want in the episode and do the actual cutting onto the shop floor, why don't you hand it over to me and let me do a quick pass and fiddle with a couple of the levels and EQ and whatnot. And then I got it, and this is such a classic example of like my naivety, because I was like, oh yeah, hang on, you've got one, because we're it's all homemade, there's no in person, there's no studio or whatever. We have one mic for the 6 of us in the dude's kitchen, so music coming out of a laptop speaker somewhere. So I was like, oh yeah, this is way outside. I can do nothing to clean up this audio. I put it, I boosted the audio a little bit, but leveled the range, the audio range, and ran it through an EQ. But then I was like, yeah, actually, I'm just gonna leave this to you, because it's also 6 hours, and there's no way I'm going through that. So I just kind of push that back over to you, as I've barely put the lightest of touches on it. But I think it did make a slight improvement. But no, I'm going back to editing my show, I'm like, this is my safe space. I know what I'm doing. 2 tracks, nice and clean, just vocals, no messing around. So anyway, apologies for that distraction, but it was literally happened yesterday, so it's very
very fresh in your mind. Yeah.
Yeah, Dan, like, you way underestimated how dirty that track would be.
Yeah. Well, that. Getting back, even bringing that back into the relationships. I mean, that's something that I've had to talk with some of the players about. Particularly, there's every so often there's somebody that's still got some there's something else that they're trying to take care of during the downtime in between their characters, and every so often I'm having to like tell them, hey, can you mute your mic? I'm picking up typing, or this, that, or the other. And also that's if you got a decent relationship with the people that you're working with, then that doesn't come across as too critical every
Yes.
so often or something like that. But I've been over like the out of game and like the stuff like between players and the characters and the DM and everything. But one of the things that really also drew me to this topic was the fact of it's kind of the basis, one of the bases something.
Mhm.
Well, I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah. A big part.
big part of the podcast is that all of the characters are adopted siblings,
Mhm.
even though they come from a variety of different races, which in the world that they're in mature at various different speeds.
Mhm.
And that really just, I wanted to use that to kind of like highlight how important it is to do a session zero, or at least have a discussion with your players before you actually start, so they understand, they have an idea at least of how their characters interact with each other, how they're connected.
Mhm.
Our session zero, which we among ourselves we refer to as the lost episode because we
Mhm.
tried to record and the audio software failed, was them as children before they had actually before they'd actually become adults and taken class levels and gone off to you know do whatever.
Mhm.
And it was it was literally for them to establish not only who their characters were so that everybody else understood, but also establish how do they interact with each other. Like, there was one character that from the get-go was set up to be the big brother because he comes from the character Crostrum comes from a homebrew race called the Garaki, which are beings with earth elemental heritage. So, and
Okay.
they have an average lifespan of 1,000 years, but it also takes them about 100 years or so to actually reach physical maturity. So he's a character that is basically like, he is far older than any of the other characters. He's the one that basically is, on the cusp of adulthood. So he's
Mhm.
obviously the responsible one. But
Mhm.
with the others, they were kind of like, for the most part, I think that we had a Dragonborn who was 6 years old. We had, a Tiefling and an Asamar who, were, like 12, 13. There was one character that had they mature slightly slower than humans. So he was like 15, but still mentally the equivalent of like 11, 12
Mhm.
years old. So it's figuring out like, okay, which of these characters is responsible, which of these will generally be a good kid but is easily led into pranks by their siblings, which one is the one that instigates all of said pranks, trying to figure out, what's going on. And it worked amazing from my perspective because everybody, not only it gave them introduction to the world and how everything was set up, but it also let them figure out, okay, this is fun. This is how we interact. This is the basis of how we're going to have our adult characters fall in and and work with each other. Because the premise of the campaign was that their adopted father got murdered, and
Mhm.
just it's a robbery gone wrong, and that kind of set the crack in their cohesiveness as a family. And then as each one kind of reached maturity, then they kind of went off on their own and became a player character. And then the podcast officially started with them kind of all coming back home after being tracked down by an old childhood friend of theirs who had found something in her father's belongings that kind of related to their adopted dad that she felt
Ooh.
they needed to, that they probably would want to know about.
Yeah, it's quite noir in a way. It's like, someone coming through the door of your PI's office and being like, I found this, smoking gun in this person's office. And
And yeah, and that became the impetus for the whole the campaign. The idea, the premise is that they actually were locked in a temporal stasis for 1,000 years, and they basically missed an entire cataclysm that basically happened minutes after they got locked into this temporal stasis. That kind of changed the world from what they knew into this entirely new one. And, of course, 1,000 years have passed. All this knowledge that was commonplace for them is now considered either lost or so beyond the understanding of people at the time that they're at that it might as well be unusable. So it's them trying to navigate, okay, how do we figure out how to, like, what do we, how does our knowledge of the past relate to what we're doing here?
Yeah.
A lot of their adventures come down to them having made a kind of a name for themselves as, having anytime there's something new that that people can't figure out, like eventually they get contracted to come in and deal with it because they've kind of got some personal knowledge. It lets the not only the lets me use that, it lets the PCs go and have some personal connection to everything that they've done. Like the most recent arc of the podcast has been them basically dealing with. They got strangely enough, they got invitations to allow direct invitations to allow them into these archmage quarters at a university. That the university survived the cataclysm, but all the archmages didn't. So there shouldn't be anybody alive to actually send these invitations out.
It's awesome.
So, and it turns out that the people that did survive and did it in such a weird way, they actually were deeply connected to these characters just by chance. So that, that was kind of a way that let me work things out. It lets me put all this ancient stuff. I mentioned at the offset that I've got that our Patreon stuff includes like a modern day setting, and that one, that storyline initially started as bonus content that I would release occasionally in between the normal episodes before it moved to Patreon. But the characters in that setting are also related in one way or another to the characters in the main storyline. Like it's basically been established among all, like with all the players in both storylines, that the character Emmett from the side podcast is a direct descendant of the Tiefling and Aasimar characters.
Oh.
So he is a Tiefling, his brother is an Aasimar, and like his family doesn't just, they kind of roll with it. They don't know necessarily where this heritage came from, but then, sometimes Aasimar and Tieflings just pop up in human lineages.
Yes.
So, they're just like, okay, well, it's got to be there somewhere. Well, that's where it comes from.
I gotta ask, and there is a reason why I'm asking this. Are you a fan of British sitcoms at all?
To an extent, I was. I'm Monty Python. Pretty pretty much was my formulative humor. That and a bit of Blackadder. So
okay, well, very very strong in examples there. The only reason I ask is because your setup there of like being trapped in, some temporal stasis is a setup to a British sitcom based off a series of books called Red Dwarf.
Oh god, yeah. There are all these things that like I'm probably pretty sure that influenced me at some point, because I did love Red Dwarf. Never got to watch the whole series, but I'm pretty sure that has some influence, even if I never really recognized it.
That's great, because that was such a seminal part of me growing up. I'd seen them all a billion times. And yeah, for those that don't know, but all my British listeners now are probably cheering from the rooftops for such a deep cut here. But in that, the main character, a guy called Lister, he basically gets in trouble on this mining spaceship out in deep space in the near-ish future. So much so that they put them in their form of prison, which is stasis. So you're like literally in this temporal stasis. Shortly after that, an explosion happens on the ship, and like a radiation explosion, and wipes out all of the crew. So the computer AI keeps him in stasis until the radiation levels are safe to be released, which happens to be 3 million years into the future. So for him, he's just stepped in and stepped out, and it's 3 million years into the future. He's maybe the only human left alive because they're miles away from Earth, and so on and so on. So yes, that just as soon as you said temporally locked in stasis and they've woken up 1,000 years later, I was like, that is a fantastic idea, and I'm annoyed that I've never thought of it either.
Yeah, that yes. I mean, as much as I love it, now it's going to bother me because I
Oh, I'm
was.
sorry. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it's like,
I don't
I
mean to
can't believe.
diminish. I don't mean to
No.
diminish your like expertise at all. I'm praising it.
Oh no, I mean it doesn't like I have long ago accepted that there is technically no such thing as an original idea.
Indeed,
Somebody's had it
yes.
somewhere. But it's just like, oh man, I can't believe I never saw that connection before.
That's that. What you mentioned there that all the players in your campaign are adopted siblings, and obviously that's quite a USP, unique selling point there. In that there's obviously so much baggage as you've just nicely explained. Would you encourage something similar for an off the shelf game or a pickup game of like having those pre-existing relationships between characters?
Yes and no, because I mean sometimes it helps with especially new players, helps them give a starting point for figuring
Mm,
out like how to role play.
yeah.
Especially if because everybody's got well, I say everybody, it's very common for somebody if they don't have siblings, then they've got cousins or very close friends that
Yes.
they just have these off the cuff conversations with, or they'll have in jokes or whatever. And especially if it's somebody, say in your group, you've got a player that's been playing with you for a while, and they're like, "Oh yeah, my coworker, that good friends of mine, they've always wanted to play, and we've got an opening because so and so had to leave. Do you mind if they come in and try playing?" And then if you suggest as the DM, you're like, "Okay, cool, that's great," and you talk with them and say, "Hey, why don't you go and have it set up that your character is already a friend of this, their real life friend's character." That way it gives them kind of a starting point. One, it helps integrate them into the game. Also, like, why is this character even joining? Where did they come from? But it also helps them get kind of a starting point as to how to interact with everybody.
Hmm.
Because then they're like, okay, oh, it's okay to kind of joke and come up with these wild stories. And then they can talk with their, then those two players can talk out of character and out of game and figure out, like, oh, yeah, maybe they can come up with their own interpersonal stories that then they can bring to the game, and it helps not just help make a relationship between those two characters to kind of help with the role play, make everything more fun, help the other players kind of enjoy the interactions between them, but it also helps establish a good relationship with the new player and the game, because it's learning the rules has been the biggest problem I've had with new players. It's like
Yeah.
it's they can do the role play, or they can learn the rules, and a lot of them have trouble doing both, and it really sours the experience for
Yes.
them.
Yeah. Both halves kind of get diminished a little bit because they're suffering from the other half not being quite there yet.
Yeah, and using that same example, like as I said, if people have if they have siblings, they have cousins, like that way, using that, hey, if you want to go and make your characters connected already, to, go ahead and have them. I've played in several campaigns in the past where all the player characters were related, or multiples were related. One in particular that I really remember distinctly that I just thought was it's one that always that kept it was a very funny one because it was also one where we threw the DM for a loop, and if we didn't have a good relationship with him, then if we weren't willing to kind of go with whatever he threw at us, we probably would have had to scrap the campaign. Um, but our characters, one was human, one was full elf, and myself was half elf.
Hmm.
The elf was the oldest, the human was the second oldest, and I was the youngest. And the thing was is that my parents were the elf's mother and the human's father. So we were all siblings, and we kind of, we had that dynamic where we were constantly
Yeah.
arguing. But anytime somebody went to, go after one of us, the other two would then immediately jump on them. And then because we had that dynamic, we had already we basically out of game had worked up all of these tag team strategies where we would all play off of each other's strengths, which turned out to be devastatingly effective in combat. And we ended up there was supposed to be this arc where this big bad, it was like this werewolf with character levels, was supposed to kidnap somebody, and the whole arc was supposed to be us chasing the guy down and fighting through all this to try and rescue the person and then removing the curse of lycanthropy from them. And thanks to some really lucky rolls and these tactics and because we had made these tactics up because our characters were so connected, we ended up killing this big bad guy that should have been way out of our league. And the DM was like, well, that's a whole campaign I've got to throw out. So, what are we going to do here?
So as I said earlier on, I've got my druid player. He's rerolling a character. I've got another player rerolling one of their characters over the Christmas holidays. And it's something I've encouraged both of them. I've said, really do think, I provide them a credits list of every NPC they've ever met and what that person was doing, shop owner, this, that, and the other, ship captain, whatever it may be. And I've said, take the whole team, refresh your memory on the session logs, refresh memory of the NPCs, because then we'll come back fresh face to the new year. But specifically for the two making a new character, take a look through that NPC list, and also bear in mind who you've still got in the party. I would strongly encourage some relationships with some of those. Now, I'm not saying you're the wife of this person or you're the partner of this person, something that strong, not necessarily. It can be a passing relationship, like you worked together once in the past. But I think even something small like that can make a huge difference. And it's something that a number of this is a failing on my part again, that a number of my players suffered with is no or very few ties to the world, I think, is really the crux of the matter. So I've said to them, just think about your ties to the world. It doesn't have to be, I'm one of the other player characters' brothers. It doesn't need to be that strong. It just needs to be I have a girlfriend back at home, or I have a shop that I need to provide money for, or I have whatever it may be that, my uncle who lives up in the mountains, I need to send him a care package every month. Anything like that. I think any kind of pre-existing relationships is only a good thing. Not necessary, but can be a very good thing. I would say if you don't have them, there needs to be quite a compelling reason why not. That then should be enough juice for the DM to build something off of that compelling reason. There should be enough meat on the bones there to then spin it in a different way, in interesting new ways during the course of the campaign. But that would be my thoughts on it. And as I said, I've really encouraged the two players to guys, you've got 4 weeks off. Review your notes, review who you've spoken to, what you've done, and I'm more than happy to be yes, you can be his ex-bodyguard, or you can be their former tailor. I don't, anything like that.
That's something that is really that's a really good way to do that. It could be as simple as, this is the baker that you buy pastries from every morning on your way to work.
Yeah,
there's a shop that I stop at, either to refuel my car, but I frequently will stop on my way into work, especially when I've got several shifts in a row that I've got to work. So I'm okay, I'm gonna just stock up on some snacks, maybe buy a sandwich that I can eat half of one night and half of the next night, and then and the people there know me. We don't know each other's names, but we know each other by face. They know generally what I buy. We know generally what's going on in each other's lives just through small talk.
Yes, yeah.
You have that, and if I don't see somebody, or if I saw somebody really looking haggard, I would notice. I would know that there's something wrong going on there. And that's and even having that connection with that shopkeeper, suddenly you can go and say oh, well, I've been by there 3 days in a row and the shopkeeper and their shop is closed. What's going on? Or, it could be that you can use that as, an adventure hook, hey, you're part of an adventuring party. my family out here is having problems. Is there any way I can hire you to go do that, to go,
Yeah.
check on them, see what's going on? It's not just to give it's, one, it gives them role play opportunities. Two, it gives you as the DM an opportunity to, make the story that they're playing through personalized in a way that, the big problem with a lot of stories is not necessarily that the story isn't fun. It's finding a way to make the player care about the story.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you can, the easiest way to do that is, of course, make their character have a reason to care. Connecting the people to the world in the podcast. And I've already mentioned that in the main storyline, the player characters are constantly being asked to look into this stuff that is kind of remnants from their time.
Mhm.
So it gives them a reason to care. It gives them a reason to interact with these people, not just to explore, okay, this is a trip down memory lane for us, but also it's a way for them to understand how the world's culture has changed since their time. It lets them it gives them a more personal idea of the lore, because that way when they make lore checks about certain things, it's not just what they know from that time, but what their specific training and background let them know about these items.
Yeah. I find it funny because, like, there's so many instances of things that people do every day in the real world, like you've just described, and somehow when it comes to the fantasy land that we all enjoy playing, a lot of that stuff just goes out the window. And my second job was at a convenience store, so a co-op in the UK, and precisely like you said, I would know you're working regular shifts, so you work the same time every week, so you get to know the same people that come in at those same times every week. So often they live above the shop in the in the flats above the shop, and you do get to know them, as you said, and you do get to be like, oh, it's you guys, you're buying your, no milk today, and one of the guys, I was talking to him, and long story short is he was in the career that I was looking to get into way back when, and I eventually said, like, hey, could you spare 5 minutes, 10 minutes talking about, recommendations, tips, as a young person does trying to get into a new career. And yeah, we ended up going for a drink after work, one day at the local pub, so he could talk me through that kind of stuff. That stuff happens all the time, and it's so organic and dynamic. So there's no reason why that stuff can't happen in in your D&D TTRPG campaign. And sometimes I feel like some players are a little bit scared of doing that stuff because I don't want to step on the DM's toes to be like, oh, maybe I will. No, as long as it's not like, I know the king of the castle and all the guards as well are my best friends, and we can never be arrested because they're my best friends. Like, as long as it's not anything like that, it can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've in the main storyline, I mean, I haven't had much to really get into it so far, but I mean, one of the characters in the main podcast actually has a kid. He had basically basically in the world of our podcast, Dragonborn are extremely rare. And the thing is that he meets up with another Dragonborn, and they, have a nice adult encounter. And it turns out, well, a kid comes from that, and and I basically posed it to and that was also, well, I posed it to the character as like, look, anything from here that goes on, that's going to be up to you and your character, how you want that to go, how involved you want to be in the kid's life. Do you want to like actually have like establish like some kind of continued relationship with the mother? And it actually played a lot into the storyline, because then it kind of explored some of the character's biological father, and there's some plot elements in that that if you want to hear about that, you can go and listen to the podcast. I'm not gonna that's too much to delve into here, but yeah,
Sure.
it just, even those small little things, just it's something that makes the world a little bit more involved. It makes it less that just some video game that you're picking up, and more an actual involved story that you're taking part in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and from small seeds do mighty oaks grow, as they say. And yeah, so even from something that might seem inconsequential, like this guy was my tailor for my high school prom, can spin. If you'll pardon the appropriate
Yeah.
terminology, you could spin anything out of that.
Yeah, there's always the memes online about like, okay, the DM has this idea, like this is the plot, the quest giver that you need to talk to, and they just kind of give off a couple throwaway NPCs,
Mhm.
and the players want to go talk to Boblin the Goblin over
Yep.
there that the DM has no idea what this person is supposed to be, but suddenly that's their favorite NPC, and now they're in love with it, and you've got to figure out what is this character.
I did have a question for you
Okay.
to shift gears from in game back to out of game, actually, for a second. So, in your game, are any of the players, did they have pre existing relationships? Are they friends, family, or is it random pickups, or how is it for you?
So let's see. Four of the players I did not know before I basically put out like a little casting call.
Hmm.
Two of them I did know. One I had known previously. He was kind of a mutual friend of a friend. We never really played in any games together, but we knew of each other. We knew who each other were, and we had a decent friendly relationship with that. The UK, the player in the UK, he and I had begun interacting in a D&D group because he very frequently posts, just questions about character concepts and ideas, and we would always have some very friendly
Hmm.
debate and discussions about stuff like that. So already had a decent working relationship. The rest of the players, as I said, they were just complete strangers to me. Two of them were in a relationship
Okay,
that has since dissolved, but of course they still remain friends and everything
that's
is
good.
okay. That was, it was, yeah. So I mean, yeah, it was weird. That was also kind of like one of the things that really had me on edge when I first started out, because these are people that don't know each other. We don't, it's not like we've interacted before, and this is something we came up as a group. This is basically them you know, answering a casting call that I put out,
Mm,
and that was a big thing. It's like, so is the unknown. It's kind of like dating somebody for the first time, in that,
yeah.
okay, I've got to put a lot of energy and input. Is it going to pay out? Is it something that I'm going to find out, first date? Oh my gosh, this is somebody who's a Holocaust denier,
Mm,
or
yep.
or are we just not going to have any chemistry and it's not anything that's worth pursuing? This is something that we can really keep going. So yeah, that was a big thing. And over the almost 2 years now that we've been working together, it's really blossomed into something pretty awesome
Mm.
from my perspective.
That's amazing to hear. The reason I say it's extra interesting is because I've only ever played with people I have a pre-existing relationship with in some form or another. I should tell a lie that there's one or two players I don't know, but they are very much friends of a friend or something like that. There's absolutely a pre-existing relationship. It has never been a cold call. It has never been anything like that. And I guess my stupid question is like, do you think one way is better? Do you think like a pre-existing relationship helps, but it's a different experience? So I imagine no one's better than the other. It's just a different kind of experience, a learning curve.
I don't know that I could really answer that question, because I've done it both ways. And I think that having a pre-existing relationship helps, because then you kind of already have an idea of that person's quirks
Yeah.
and issues out of character, so that it's easier for you to tell, like, okay, they're not being a jerk, this is just how they role play, or like, okay, this is, this is just kind of how they word things. And it's also easier to talk with somebody that you already have a pre-existing relationship with,
Hmm.
when there's some kind of discord going on in the group, or any kind of weird conflicts in between the characters. But given that, but the thing is also from the other side is that um, this hobby is a great way to make new friends too.
Yeah.
So like going in with, yeah, it's scary to go out, and play with a group of people that you've never played with, or have somebody that's a complete stranger join in the group. But it's still like something that can be very rewarding because new relationships can grow from that. And the thing is, like, okay, well, maybe it's because when that somebody new joins the group, it may be that the group you were in was kind of toxic, but you didn't really, either you didn't realize it, or you were kind of like, oh well, this is the only thing in the area that's around.
Yeah.
They're the only people I know that play D&D, so you kind of put up with it, and it's not until this new person joins and kind of, maybe they join in, and suddenly the way you're able to see the DM interact with somebody new that isn't their friend, and you realize, okay, hold on, that's kind of awful. Or maybe, or suddenly you're like, the players that you're with, they're not really playing the kind of game that you enjoy, but you still play with them because it's the only game you've got. And somebody else comes in that has a play style very close to yours, and maybe through them they introduce you to more people. Or there's a lot of it, the big problem I keep seeing with people is that, oh well, I really want to learn how to play, but I don't know anybody that plays, or there's none of my friends want to do that. I'm like, well, sometimes you have to go out and jump into the deep end. Find your local game store, or play online with some people. And you never know what kind of friendships you can get, what kind of life experiences you can get from interacting with different people, different walks of life. I mean, there are even the games that I listen to online, like some of the podcasts, they also have people from multiple different countries that are all together talking to each other and playing in the same game. And it's like you never, especially in this age of online interaction, you can connect with so many different people through this common interest. And it's an amazing tool. You just have to be willing to go out and take the little bit of risks to build that new relationship.
Well, perfect. So thank you for that. It's absolutely true. And now, well, as you were talking, I was thinking, like, I did join one game where I only knew one person, and all the rest were their close friends and colleagues, and we were playing in person. So I had an in. It wasn't just as a completely cold open, and they invited me to join, and we turned. I was the first one to turn up at the host's and the DM's house, and I was like, damn, really wish the social glue was here to smooth this out, because now I'm just kind of like, hey, I'm in your home and you don't know me, and I'm here to sit in your house and drink your drinks for 6 hours. But now that is, I still play with those guys to this day, and I'm very close friends with them. And that was from nothing to, we're talking about planning holidays and stuff together. So no, that's absolutely right. And very wholesome way to round out the episode. That is, unless, of course, you had anything specific that you wanted to cover that we might not have got to yet.
No, I think from the various ramblings, I think we've covered basically everything that I could talk about that's pertinent.
I mean, yes, but also, like, I love talking about this kind of stuff for days, and there's. We could talk about the the interesting dynamic between DMs and players, and that kind of unique relationship there. Frenemies to a certain extent, and all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a lot more there. Perhaps for around 2 one day. We'll never know. But no. So is there last part of the show? Is there anything you would like to promote?
Well, obviously, of course, promoting my podcast, A Sundered World. It can be found pretty much every major podcast platform: iTunes, Stitcher, Google, Spotify. We do have a Patreon. I keep links to it in all the show notes of all my episodes. The Patreon is to go towards like the actual production of this RPG setting. I release lore. I'm actually a bit behind, but I release lore casts as part of the Patreon. There is the Stumpwater Tales, which is our side podcast. Basically, like our first, the first season of the Stumpwater Tales is also available as bonus content on the main line. But then you also now that the rest of the episodes will be available through Patreon. I have a book that can be found on Amazon. Unbalanced Scales is the title of it. It is more lore about Beerwith. It's set in that world. It's about basically a group of mercenaries turned archaeology, basically turned kind of Indiana Jones style treasure hunters. They were stumble upon something, get contracted by a collector to find the rest of a similar set, and end up finding out that there's a lot more to this than they bargained for or ever wanted. I also have a Discord for not just fans of the show. That is also for any like-minded people to come and discuss D&D, discuss the podcast, discuss the world of Beerwith. I run one-shots there just to help new people or to help people experience different tabletop RPGs outside of D&D, because sometimes people like the tabletop experience, but D&D isn't their thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of different systems, but then it also exposes them to different ideas and hopefully gives them ideas for their own games. And that's why I try to do this stuff.
Thank you. Absolutely. And likewise, as usual, all the links to Hunter's stuff will be in the episode description as usual. So I would encourage you to check it all out. So all that's left to say is thank you ever so much for joining us today, Hunter.
Thank you very much for having me on.
No problem at all. Thank you to everybody for listening at home. For those who wish to click through, as usual, find me on all the socials, including Patreon and Ko-fi. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and good night. And now it's time for the Patreon shout-outs. Huge thank you to a great friend of the show, Matthew Perkins, who's out there making hilarious and educational Dungeons & Dragons content. Please go and check out his stuff at matthewperkins.net, where you can find links to all of his socials and all of his content, including his own Patreon, which I would very much encourage you to check out. Thank you to Matt Street, at mpstreet88 on Twitter, for supporting the show. If you need support running your personal or business schedule, head to virtualtimehustle.com or on Instagram to make that difference between should do and done. Boss it better with support from Kat, who will help you get back that essential time you've been searching for. If you would like to support what we do and get 4 shout-outs a month, head over to patreon.com/thinkingcritically, or you can just buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/thinkingcritically,